Hello, my name's Gavin. This is Genre Books, and I'm going to hell, and you're all coming with me. This is the second of my Project Rabbit Hole videos, and taking a break from the Sims holes of last week, we're looking at something a little more metaphysical this week. Bangsian fantasy. Now, with Bangsian fantasy, the bad news is that you're dead. The good news is you're somehow still alive. The bad news is that you're in Hades. The good news is this is the old kind of Hades before people started putting moral judgments on whether you've been good or bad. You're just where everybody ended up. The good news is that people are taking an interest in your plight and still writing about it. The bad news is that so much of it seems to be of a comical nature. In talking about Bangsian fantasy, we are going to have to pay a little bit of attention to mythology or religion, but I'm going to try to keep that to the barest minimum. I'm just looking here at the literary antecedents, and I want to start with Lucian of Samosata. Now, he gets mentioned in any extensive history of science fiction. His work, A True Story, is supposed to be one of the first, or the first, science fiction story. But I'm not talking about a true story today. I'm talking about the Dialogues of the Dead. He has a character visit the underworld. And in the underworld we meet Diogenes and Menippus. Menippus being Diogenes' pupil when they were alive. And we see them, these are real personages who led very simple lives of poverty and self-denial. And there is a very frugal life in the underworld, but to them it is a world of absolute luxury. We then meet other people who enjoyed much more luxury in the real world, and given exactly the same comforts as Diogenes and Menippus are now given, are living lives of absolute hell. So yeah, that's your very, very old satire taken care of. Keeping with the Hellenic world, Aristophanes and the Frogs. In this play we have strong Bangsian hallmarks as well. The god of theatre, Dionysius, travels to the underworld and adjudicates an argument between Euripides and Aeschylus about the nature of theatre and what's important about theatre. I can't remember who won the argument or why, but we just have an example here of taking deceased historical personages and putting words in their mouths. Fast forward to the early 14th century and we get Dante's Inferno, which I do intend to read soon as part of this project. And here we are looking at a Bangsian fantasy of a more serious tone, but still retaining those Bangsian hallmarks. Dante himself is imagining himself dead here, but being led around hell by Virgil. So again, using historical personages because you can, because the list of the dead includes your best character pool you could ever hope to see, and characters who your audience is already familiar with. As a companion piece to Inferno, I shall also be reading Inferno by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. This time no Dante, we have a science fiction writer. This time no Virgil, he's being led by Benito Mussolini. And that is certainly a subgenre of making fascists say what you want them to, which Philip Jose Farmer does in the Riverworld series. This is the fourth book in the Riverworld series, which I hope to get to later this year. In the last couple of months, I've read To Your Scattered Bodies Go and The Fabulous Riverboat. Next week, I'm starting The Dark Design, and after The Dark Design, this will be the next one in the series. But here, all of humanity is resurrected and finds themselves all on the banks of an endless river. Not the Styx, but close enough. I'll be talking about the Riverworld series more in depth as part of this series once I've finished it. I don't know whether anybody famous turns up in this book, Operation Chaos by Paul Anderson, but we have a couple, a werewolf and a witch, who journey to hell to find their daughter. Of course, the original Bangsian fantasy is probably the story of Orpheus. I should have mentioned him earlier. And the shared universe idea of setting something in hell, or the afterworld, or the afterlife, or the underworld, continues with Janet Morris's series Heroes in Hell. Janet Morris, C.J. Cherry, Greg Benford, plenty of other writers, I believe. David Drake. There are, I think, over 15 books in this series. I've got the first two, which I'm going to read and make a decision whether I want to look at any more. But here we have the same pattern repeating itself. Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, Alexander the Great, Judah Maccabee, Che Guevara, and Yuri Andropov. So, if you're putting together superhero teams, the afterlife seems to be a very good place to do so. I don't think there is a novelisation of Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey where they travel to hell. If there is, I'm going to track it down and get a copy for this project, but I don't hold out much hope. John Kendrick Bangs was born in 1862 in New York State to a wealthy family. His father and his uncle were both founding partners of a fairly successful law firm. He went to Columbia College, where he edited the college's literary magazine, and it is as an editor that he makes his career initially. He is a departmental editor or an editor for Life magazine, Harper's Magazine, Harper's Bazaar, Harper's Young People, Muncie Magazine. I think he's the first editor of the Muncie Magazine, Literature, and Puck. But he's a writer as well. And I think his first big success was a parody. He works a lot in parody, but he is parodying Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland with his work Alice in Blunderland. And this is, I think, very much a political parody. He also has a long-running series called The Idiot, or where the main character is the idiot. And he writes a lot of other short stories and parodies and pastiches. I think after Raffles, he writes 2 books on Mrs. Raffles. He also writes a Sherlock Holmes pastiche. He also writes some Christmas stories, which I read just this last Christmas and absolutely loved. But we are here today to talk about the Associated Shades series. This is the series that we derive the term Bangsian fantasy from. And there are 4 books, not very long books, but there are 4 books in the series. A Houseboat on the Styx, The Pursuit of the Houseboat, The Enchanted Typewriter, and Mr. Munchausen. These books were all written between 1895 and 1901, and I'm not sure about all of them, but certainly they a couple of these were very successful and bestsellers, almost bestsellers for the year in which they were printed. In no small part, perhaps, is the fact that Bangs manages to get one of the most famous illustrators at the time, Peter Newell. Now, he would have known Newell from editing magazines, because Newell produced a lot of illustrations for magazines, but in terms of books, he famously did the illustrations for Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, and Lewis Carroll. And he does the Associated Shades series. The Associated Shades series is set in Hades. It's set on the River Styx. The houseboat is on the River Styx. The janitor of this houseboat is Charon, the boatman for the River Styx, who is a little bit put out that his ferry service seems to have a rival. This is very much a non-judgmental Hades. This is the very earliest incarnation of Hades. Everybody is here, good or bad. Many of the members of the Associated Shades Club are neither good nor bad. They are bureaucratic, persnickety, petty, and argumentative, but not really evil. The Associated Shades is an exclusive club who build the houseboat in order to have their club, which is, I say exclusive, it seems to have a very broad membership, but is limited to men only, in the way that clubs certainly were in Bangs' day, and in some cases still are today. And he is poking gentle fun at the activities and the way these clubs are run. All of the characters are borrowed from history. In the first book alone, we have an absolute cavalcade of historical personages. Samuel Johnson and Boswell, Dryden, Carlyle, Tennyson, Shakespeare, Bacon, Raleigh, Confucius, Socrates, Diogenes, so back there to Lucian of Samosata, Demosthenes, Homer, Adam, Noah, Samson, Nero, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Makepeace Thackeray, Hamlet, so we do get fictional characters introduced here as well, Robert Burns, George Washington, Wellington, Napoleon, Darwin, Columbus, Dr. Livingstone, Cassius, Munchausen, again fictional, Ptolemy, Cicero, Charles I. This really is why we call this kind of fantasy Bangsian fantasy. He's the one who really goes big on the historical personages. It is the freedom to plunder all of history for your characters and make them say what you want them to. Everyone who has ever died has gone to the River Styx, into this Greek underworld. They haven't all arrived at the same time, like in the Riverworld, but the Riverworld borrows an awful lot from this series. Unlike with the Riverworld, Bangs is writing these books for the laughs. The passage of time, these are all 125, 130 years old now. It means that the laughs aren't always there, but there are surprisingly more hits than there are misses. Nothing that has me rolling in the aisles, but it raises a chuckle from time to time. I think best described as wry for the best part. But in the first book, A Houseboat on the River Styx, this is kept episodic, anecdotal, more about the linguistic cut and thrust between all of the characters which are being introduced. In the sequel, In Pursuit of the Houseboat, we get more of the same, but certainly with a bit more narrative structure involved. More importantly, we are introduced here to the ladies of Hades. They have been unfairly excluded from the associated shades, and they know that they are unfairly excluded and decide to put that matter right. Whilst all of the men have gone off to see a wrestling match, I think between Samson and Goliath, they go on to the houseboat and take a look around and find it to their liking. Unfortunately, at the same time, a group of pirates have decided to steal the houseboat and take the moment when all of the ladies are in the clubhouse to do so. And they don't realise that they are moving until it is too late. The men return after the wrestling match and find the houseboat gone. Who can they call on to help them track down the houseboat but the world's greatest detective, Sherlock Holmes? And this is something which does separate Bangs from other Bangsian fantasy writers, in that he is able to employ fictional characters. I mean, there are fictional characters in other Bangsian fantasy literature, but they are the inventions of the authors themselves. Neither Munchausen nor Sherlock Holmes was invented by Bangs. Munchausen, I think, was never in copyright, but Arthur Conan Doyle was fairly protective about Sherlock Holmes and had denied other writers the use of the Sherlock Holmes characters, which is why we have people like Solar Pons turn up, because August Derleth couldn't write on using Sherlock Holmes as a character. But Arthur Conan Doyle was a fan of John Kendrick Bangs, and maybe had one eye on knowing that John Kendrick Bangs was also an editor of some influential American magazines. That probably didn't hurt. But Bangs has had the happy accident of asking to use the Sherlock Holmes character at exactly the right time. Sherlock Holmes, in 1896, 1897, when this book came out, is canonically dead. He's fallen over the waterfall with Moriarty and has not yet returned. So he is eligible to turn up in the Greek underworld when this book first comes out. Bangs does, however, realise it's a big thing to be able to use the Sherlock Holmes character, and makes full use of him, and dedicates the second book here, In Pursuit of the Houseboat, to Arthur Conan Doyle. He does make Sherlock Holmes into a bit of a figure of fun. These are probably the most amusing passages in the book. It's to pull the rug out from Holmes as the genius on a couple of occasions, and that is genuinely funny. The rest of the humour does come from the same dialogue-driven cut and thrust between the various characters, but here we are introduced to a slew of more historical personages, with all of the female characters arriving. So we have Cleopatra, Elizabeth I, Xanthippe, lots of female characters. And they are as useless as the men. So that is, equality of a sort. The remaining two books have a very different framing. They are not set in Hades itself. We are corresponding with Hades via the mediums of a typewriter in the Enchanted Typewriter and a telephone in Mr. Munchausen. In the Enchanted Typewriter, our protagonist, who may well be Bangs himself, is communicated to by initially James Boswell via Bangs' typewriter. It starts, looks like it's possessed, it's haunted to begin with, and, in a very real sense, it is. But Boswell is quite chatty, and Bangs is able to talk to Boswell by typing into the typewriter. Boswell somehow able to read that and respond. Boswell is imprisoned in Hades for a while and is replaced by, is it Xanthippe or Xanthippe? Mrs. Socrates, who not only starts and continues the conversation with Bangs, but also trashes the circulation of the newspaper that Boswell has been using the enchanted typewriter to produce. This is, again, going back to the anecdotal side of the first book, but without as much of the dialogue humour, because there just aren't as many participants. In a way, it's a little bit richer because we're able to concentrate on a few stories and characters rather than, in the first book, a new character seemingly introduced every page or two. But at the same time, you miss that rapid fire repartee and, lots of misunderstandings where the comedy comes from in the dialogues of the first two books. And the fourth book, Mr. Munchausen, similar in structure to the Enchanted Typewriter, but again, more anecdotal. But the conceit here is that Bangs is just called one day on the telephone by Baron Munchausen, who is calling from Hades. He'll call back the next morning if he wants to have someone there to transcribe his news stories. This is going to make Bangs a fortune. And the next morning, he gets a stenographer to turn up. Munchausen calls at the prearranged time and dictates his latest batch of stories. This is just a very elaborate framing for Bangs to write a new batch of Baron Munchausen stories. I say Baron Munchausen is Mr. Munchausen here because there are no titles in Hades. The framing does get a little bit complicated. The stenographer is taking dictation from Munchausen, who is relating a conversation he had with someone interviewing him in Hades. It's a little bit convoluted, and this is done for laughs, but we are taking it back in a way, in a very roundabout way, to those first Bangsian fantasies where we are just looking at dialogues, not Aristophanes, not Lucian of Samosata, but with a late 19th, early 20th century New York satirist who was the editor of Harper's Bazaar. There is something that a lot of Bangsian fantasy does that Bangs himself doesn't do, and that is a meditation on the actual afterlife itself. I am partway through the Riverworld series and we are still divining the mystery of why they have been resurrected in that particular way. The afterlife has changed over time and dependent on culture, mythology, religion. Sometimes it is conflated with a literal underground or underworld, which is why it counts for my Project Rabbit Hole series. These aren't so much lost worlds as worlds that we can never know, and seeing them described and tales told about them is great fun. I've only discovered John Kendrick Bangs in the last 6 months, and only because I was looking for things to include in this series and it turned up. It's been serendipitous because they're funny stories. It is serendipitous because people may wish to be reading Sherlock Holmes pastiche shortly with Holmes is Where the Heart Is, and the houseboat In Pursuit of the Houseboat definitely would count. It is serendipitous because I got to read Bangs's Christmas stories in the run-up to Christmas just gone, and I thought they were absolutely fantastic. And it's going to get me reading Dante's Inferno, which probably isn't something I would be doing were I not embarking on this silly, unending project. But there we go. I would recommend John Kendrick Bangs to anyone. These books are very short. Any one of them could be polished off within a day. His Christmas stories for next Christmas is an afternoon's work, but they're lovely. And given the gap of 120 years, they're still quite funny. Snobbishly funny, somewhat effete, rarefied, but still something I would give a qualified recommendation to you if that's your thing. But until the next time, with Project Rabbit Hole and possibly something completely different. Bye.